And let's turn now to China's Belt and Road Initiative as the country's banking officials briefed the news media this morning on industry measures and achievements supporting the project. According to the China Banking Association, the industry has actively taken part in the initiative. It's made efforts to improve cross-border funding capability and to provide comprehensive financial services. By the end of 2016, 9 Chinese-funded banks had established 62 subsidiaries and branches in 26 countries along the Belt and Road route. The banking industry also provided support for the $14.5 billion China invested directly in the countries along the routes in 2016. Well, to discuss the upcoming Belt and Road Forum and the initiative itself, we're now joined by Yu Shanwu, an international relations researcher in Johannesburg, and CGTN's Tang Bo in Beijing. Tang Bo, let's start with you. Just describe for us how preparations for the Belt and Road Forum are coming along, and of course, which world leaders are expected to be in Beijing.
Well, yesterday, officials from China's top economic planning authority, the National Development and Reform Commission, have briefed the media ahead of the upcoming forum. Some relevant government departments also participated in the press conference. The forum, which is going to be held on Sunday and Monday, May 14th and 15th, will include an opening ceremony, a leaders' roundtable summit, and other high-level sessions. And Chinese President Xi Jinping will attend the opening ceremony and host a roundtable summit. So far, more than 1,500 guests have confirmed their attendance, more than half of which are from overseas. And leaders from the World Health Organization, UNICEF, the International Labour Organization, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank have confirmed to participate. Wang Xiaotao, the Deputy Director of the National Development and Reform Commission, said at the press conference that the high-level sessions are one of the 3 major components of the forum. They consist of 1 high-level plenary session and 6 parallel sessions, focusing on 8 topics, including infrastructure, industrial investment, economic and trade cooperation, energy resources, financial cooperation, people-to-people exchanges. And during these high-level sessions, participating guests will look at ways to cooperate and propose means to implement their cooperation measures. Back to you.
Well, indeed, some of those participating guests, of course, include African leaders. Yu Shanwu, let's turn to you now. Just how is the One Belt, One Road initiative looking to really boost relations between China and African countries?
Thank you for having me. I think when we looked at the Belt and Road Initiative when it initially started, we actually didn't see a lot of African countries featuring in the initiative. And I think what we can say is that this initiative is actually still developing over time, and more you're starting to see more agreements and also cooperation between China and African countries. So if we're looking at how this might boost relations, I think very much from the economic perspective, we know that China is very strong and competitive in terms of its infrastructure development. It has the know-how in terms of manufacturing as well as industrialization, which are all very important areas where Africa is looking to develop in terms of its Agenda 2063. And also, if we think about the fact that the Belt and Road Initiative will be able to open new markets and join new markets together. So I don't think it's just about Africa and China. I think it also opens opportunities for Africa to link with Europe as well as Southeast Asia, where you see a lot of African governments realizing that there's more potential to also reach out eastward beyond China. And of course, there is also the geopolitical factor. We've seen a lot of debate about whether this initiative is China's response to globalization in a time where a lot of countries are taking protectionist measures, as well as whether this is even China's view of a new world order. And I think either way, this is potential for Africa because it means that you can provide an African voice where China is also trying to provide itself a more pronounced voice in the world. Indeed. And I think more platforms for Africa to engage in, the better. For example, if I give the instance of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation in 2015 at the summit level where African leaders in China met together, you saw a lot of agreements happen and discussions happen on the sidelines. So I think the more platforms, the better for Africa.
Indeed. connectivity seems to be at the heart of it all. Tangbo, perhaps you can expand on that for us. The One Belt, One Road initiative, as we understand it, is seeking to promote international cooperation through infrastructure connectivity. But just talk us through some of the key benefits that are envisaged or perhaps expected to come out of these partnerships.
Well, according to the Commission, the Belt and Road Forum for International Cooperation will promote ties through a platform of change and improvement with more than 50 documents on infrastructure construction expected to be signed. And priority for infrastructure construction will be given to fixing bottlenecks and mixing links in the transportation network along the Belt and Road countries, of course, including Africa as well. And besides, the forum will help accelerate infrastructure projects overseas because it will provide financial institutions with opportunities to offer co-financing. And by the end of 2016, so far, more than 100 countries and regions had expressed a willingness to support the Belt and Road initiative. And China has so far signed 46 cooperation agreements with 39 countries and regions to implement the initiative. Back to you.
Well, let's go back to you, Yushan, who, as you said earlier, this is turning out to be an important platform for African countries, allowing their voices to be heard on the geopolitical scene. But in actual fact, what should countries in Africa do when it comes to really crafting their foreign policies to maximize possible opportunities presented by the Belt and Road Initiative?
Thank you. Well, I think that's a really important question. I think often when we think about the Belt and Road Initiative, we think about what China can do for Africa. But really, it's also about, I think, what Africa can bring to the table. And as you say, how can we maximize this initiative for Africa's benefit? And I think to put this into perspective, Africa has to also realize that it is one region of this initiative, and more, for example, Latin America is also included, as well as we know Central Asia, etc. So I think it's really important to understand how this initiative benefits Africa specifically. And for example, one suggestion is really to emphasize, I think, the kind of Africa-centered initiatives that are already taking place. So if you think of, for example, the African Agenda 2063, the fact that more regional integration, regional trade, I think development as well as infrastructure development is already high on the priority. So I think it's also important to emphasize these points. I think you have a lot of concern, for example, for the fact that maybe in official speeches you don't necessarily hear Africa feature in terms of the Belt and Road. But I think what is very, I think, welcoming is the fact that if you look at, for example, FOCAC documents or other speeches, you see industrialization and Agenda 2063 feature in, I think, Chinese official speeches. And I think this is also recognition that this is important for Africa. So I think you can't really look at the two initiatives as separate. So I think it's about emphasizing that continental-led initiative. I think on the other hand, I think when you come down to the country level, that's where you start to see the complexities, because it's about whether we can ensure that agreements and rhetoric then actually translate into reality. So for example, if we're looking at the dynamics on the continent, what is the extent that countries like South Africa, for example, is able to balance the competition as well as its cooperation with its African partners. It's also, I think, about understanding whether each African country has the right investment environment, as well as, for example, we've seen in Central Asia, there's also peace and security concerns. So it's really about also addressing these areas, as well as once, for example, I think at the high level, there's agreement on taking place in the Belt and Road. Are countries able to then motivate, I suppose, their own society as well as their own private sector to get on board?
Right.
And I think that's probably what I'd like to just add finally, is that, again, to emphasize that this is very much a developing initiative, and I think that's important. And I think China realizes that it cannot do this on its own. And I think in speeches and the way that it actually frames the initiative, it's really about, I think, getting partnerships. It's about understanding what's of interest to other regions. And I think, I mean, various scholars talk about a negotiated world order, and I think China realizes that, and it's really trying to, I think, bring everyone on board according to what their perspective of what the initiative should look like.
Well, thank you so much for that analysis. Yu Shan-Wu joining us there from Johannesburg and CGTN's Tangbo in Beijing. Of course, that two-day forum gets underway on Sunday, the 15th of May.